Someone said to me last night, they said, Pastor Mark, I remember in the good old days where the men wore pants and the women wore makeup. Well, I said, I take exception to that because I wear more makeup than any woman in this place. When you're on television, do you think I can look this good naturally? I mean, I'd be way too ugly for TV if it weren't for makeup. Thank God for makeup.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Well, this morning I'm carrying on in the message I began, Write the Vision. And what we were doing was we were looking at Habakkuk chapter 2, which I think is the most informative thing that we could ever find on how to get and what to do with a vision. And he told Habakkuk to watch and see what he would say to him, and then when he got the vision, to write it down and make it plain on tablets that he who reads it may run with it. And so what we've been doing in this church is we have been writing the vision that you who read it may run with it. And the vision, the overarching vision of Church of the Rock is this: helping people to know God, live free, and to find purpose. And so last week we started with what it was to know God. And I told you that everything we do in church is predicated on that one thing, what we do when we know God. See, nothing else really works without that. Without that personal relationship, it just becomes a bunch of, humanistic principles. But when you add Jesus into the equation, everything changes. That to know God is not an event, it's not a moment. What it is, it's a lifelong process that we would pursue Him all the days of our life. Just like in any relationship, just like in a marriage, the more you spend time with that person, the more you get to know them. And so that's where it all begins, with knowing God. Well, this morning I want to talk about what it is to live free. And again, with living free, I'm not talking about finding a momentary time of freedom. People say I got free of this or I got free of that. What I want to talk to you about is what it would mean to actually live free. That every day we would live in this incredible freedom that Christ has purchased for us with the cross of Jesus Christ. And I think to understand that, I think we actually have to go back to the beginning and look at how we were created, because you were actually created to live free. Do you remember what God did? He created the Garden of Eden and He put man in it. Man lived free there. There was no sin, there was no sickness, there was no poverty, there was no war, there was no death, there was no suffering, there was no stress, there was no worrying, there were no clothes, there were no mosquitoes. I can only assume if there was no clothes, there was no mosquitoes. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but that wouldn't be paradise otherwise, would it? I think intuitively, I think within each and every one of us, we all cry out to be free. Our desire is to live free in this world, and we don't always know what that looks like, but that is our hope and that is our desire. And what you need to know is that's what Jesus came to do, was to set the captives free. And we're going to look at it today. It's in Luke chapter 4. It's in an amazing passage. And we're going to pick it up in verse 16 and understand it's talking about Jesus. And it says, "So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recover sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord.' Then he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing.'" Now, let's remember a couple of things. Jesus actually grew up in Nazareth. He was from Nazareth. And he returned to the very place that he grew up and to the very synagogue that he would have spent his whole childhood in. So they all knew who he was. And I guess they had readings in those days, like a lot of liturgical churches do today. And it was Jesus' turn, perhaps. He was chosen to read. And so he went up to give the reading from scriptures that day, and they handed him the book, probably would have been a scroll, and they handed him the book of Isaiah, and it says he found the place. He didn't just read. He went and he found the place where it was written, Isaiah 61, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me. And then he goes through that list of things, which was his mission. And then after he's read it, he goes and sits down, and everybody's looking at him. Why? Because they knew he didn't read in the right place. I mean, there was probably, some pattern that they followed, and he jumped up to Isaiah 61, and he read it, and they're all looking at him thinking, what are you doing, buddy? And he stands up and he says, oh, by the way, this day, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. What was he saying? He's saying, this was talking about me. I'm the guy, and I have come to set at liberty the oppressed and to set the captives free. Understand this, that he would have read that during the time of one of the greatest oppressions of the Jewish people. The Romans had moved in and taken over Israel and were ruling with an iron fist. And Jesus stands up and says, I have come to set the captives free. That is what Jesus' mission is. Jesus' mission is to set you free. Satan's mission is to put you in bondage. And so that is the tension that we all live in. I think the greatest gift, aside from salvation, that God has given us is the gift of free will. The right to choose. I mean, think about this. No one can actually take your right, your free will away from you. Nobody can actually make you think anything. Nobody can make you believe anything. Do you know that God actually gives us the right to either accept him or reject him if we choose? And he will not make any one of you do anything you do not want to do. Why? Because that is the power of free will. And he has given us this power to choose to do what we want. But here's the greatest irony in history, if you ask me, is that many people, when given the opportunity, will choose bondage over freedom. You say, what are you talking about? I mean, just look at the way people live today. Look at the bondage that people live in. I mean, people are in bondage to drugs and alcohol and to cigarettes and to pornography and to bitterness and anger and gambling, and the list goes on and on and on and on. We have so many bondages, and nobody made you do any of those things, did they? You used your free will and you chose those things. And it's a bizarre twist of history, but if you look, the lesson of history is that given the choice, people actually will often choose bondage or slavery over freedom. This is a picture, a map of the world. You see all those countries in red? Those countries in red are all, to this day, dictatorships. After thousands of years of human history, people are still living dictatorships all over the world. The green are those places that are sort of partially free, and the yellow are those places that have democracy. I'm wondering if you can notice by this map that those yellow areas, those places that have democracy, are the places where the gospel has gone. Why? Because he came to set the captives free. See, Israel had 630, and people go, 630 laws. Who could live with those kind of restraints? 630? Do you know how many laws we have in Canada from coast to coast? It's not 630 like Israel. It's not 6,000. It's not 600,000. There are 6 million laws in Canada from coast to coast. You know why? Because you can't be trusted to do the right thing. And you know what? Those old laws, they just stay on the books. You want to hear some of the bizarre laws that we have in Canada? Let me tell you about a few of them. Do you know in Canada it is against the law to paint a wooden ladder? You know why? Because it might be slippery when it's wet and you might slip and fall down. Do you know that in Canada it's illegal to remove a Band-Aid in public? You better not have ever done that. Do you know that in Halifax it's against the law to wear a t-shirt when you're driving a taxi? Do you know that in Toronto it's illegal to drag a dead horse down Yonge Street on a Sunday? The rest of the week's fine, but Sunday it's prohibited. Do you know that in Canada, it's against the law to kill a sick person by scaring them to death? It's against the law to scare the Queen anytime. That's just forbidden. Here's my favorite law of all in the books. It's in Alberta. In Alberta, it is against the law to set on fire a man's wooden leg. Says nothing about a woman's wooden leg, so you go ahead and knock yourself out. And so about this point, you're realizing that I'm just a little bit cynical about democracy. I'm just a little bit cynical about legislation and rules and regulations. And tell you what, I don't like to be controlled. I don't really like rules. So I was telling my daughter the other day, I was telling her what I was going to preach on. I was going to tell her about, this thing about rules and regulations and laws. And this is what came out of her mouth. I was so shocked. She said, well, Pop, don't you remember when I was 10, you taught me that rules were meant to be broken? I said, what? I didn't teach you that. She said, yeah, you did. You taught us that rules were meant to be broken. I said, I never taught you that. She said, do you want to hear the story? I said, okay. Here was the story. My kids went to this school, and at the school they had a lot of trouble with the drop-off, the parents dropping the kids off, because it was kind of out of the way, and most of the kids got driven to school. And so they came up with this elaborate system to bring order to the drop-off. And you had to go in one way. It was all one way. You had to go in one way and come out the other way. And you would have to stay in line. And then when you only got to one particular section, that was the only section you were allowed to let your kids get off. The teachers were out there directing traffic. The thing was a nuisance. I understood why they had to do it. I just didn't want to do it. And so after a few times, I thought, I'm not doing this anymore. And I was late for work, and I was dropping her off. And so I drove around to the other side of the school, and I said, get out. And she said, I can't get out. And I said, why not? She said, it's against the rules. And I said to her, rules are meant to be broken. Now get out. She says, I'll get in trouble. I said, well, you have a choice. You can either get in trouble or come to work with me because I'm going. So she got out and got in trouble. And actually, I got in trouble too. They phoned me up and said, you're doing it wrong. Of course I'm doing it wrong. I don't like your rules. It's a miracle my kids turned out all right. It turns out, here I thought I was this amazing parent. Turns out I was a terrible parent. Who would have known, right? Now, notwithstanding that ridiculous story, here's what I think. I think we were created to live free and to be self-governed, and I don't think we need to be nearly as controlled as the world thinks we need to be. Now, we have to understand what it means, because Jesus said he came to set at liberty those who are oppressed. So the big question is, what does liberty look like? What does it mean for us to live free? Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that liberty is a highway. Imagine it like the Trans-Canada Highway. And when you are riding the highway of liberty, you're getting places. But here's the thing to always remember. There are ditches on either side of the highway. And every one of you in this room, I bet, how many of you have ever been in the ditch? You've gone in the ditch. How many of you? Most of you. There's a few of you who've never done that. You're missing a good experience. And expensive. But anyway, nobody wants to go into the ditch, because if you go into the ditch, particularly in the winter, you're in big trouble. And the Trans-Canada Highway will get you somewhere, but there is some big honking ditches on either side. And that's how liberty works. Liberty is the highway, but on one side there is a ditch called legalism. On the other side there is a ditch called licentiousness, and I will explain what that crazy word means. But let's talk about these two ditches. Legalism is this. Legalism is the letter of the law. Now, I want to give you a verse from Galatians. This is what Paul said. He said, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. So he said, look, you have been made free. Christ has made you free. Christ has given you liberty, but don't use that liberty to end up back in the yoke of bondage. And what he was talking about was legalism. And what we see is that when Jesus walked the earth, who did he reserve his sharpest criticism for? What group of people? Yeah, the Pharisees, the religious people. Why? Because they put people in bondage. And he talked to them about that. And he said, the traditions of men have made the word of God of no effect. I mean, they had enough laws with 630. They didn't need a bunch of new laws. And what they did was they created new rules and new laws to control people. And we have often seen the church veer off into that ditch, have we not? Because I know there are people in this church that have grown up in a church that veered off into the ditch of legalism. And let me ask the question this way. How many of you were brought up in a church where it was considered sinful to play cards? Anybody in the room? All right, we're playing Spot the Mennonites right now, in case you're wondering what game we're playing. How many of you were brought up in a church where it was considered sinful to go to the theater to a movie? How many of you were brought up in churches like that? Now we're playing Spot the Pentecostals. How many of you were brought up in a church where it was sinful for a woman to wear pants? Now we're playing Spot the Hutterites. This is a great game. We could play this all day. And, someone said to me last night, they said, Pastor Mark, I remember in the good old days where the men wore pants and the women wore makeup. Well, I said, I take exception to that because I wear more makeup than any woman in this place when you're on television. Do you think I can look this good naturally? I mean, I'd be way too ugly for TV if it weren't for makeup. Thank God for makeup, right? All the women say amen. Amen. I know you're not all tracking with me. No, seriously. Do you think Tom Cruise really looks like that without his makeup? Right, I mean, if it weren't for his makeup, this is Tom Cruise with his makeup on. He looks great, no question about it. You want to see him without his makeup? Here he is. Look, check him out. Looks suspiciously like Gilbert Gottfried to me, but that's what he looks like without makeup. And so what the church has done is we have often veered into the ditch of legalism. But on the other side of the highway of liberty, there's another ditch called licentiousness. Now, that sounds like a fancy word, but it's really easy to understand. It comes from the word license, and it means license to do whatever you want. To the people that feel like they can do whatever they want, which is a bit of a mantra of our society, isn't it? And it is a place of lawlessness is what it is, where people are allowed to do whatever they want or think they're allowed to do whatever they want. And of course, in the New Testament, we have a church that was like that as well. And that church was the church of Corinthians. Do you remember this? There was sexual immorality and there was incest going on in that church. And Paul just rips them in 1 Corinthians because they didn't understand that they can't just do whatever they want. And if we were to look at our world today, where does our world err? Are we in the legalism ditch or are we in the licentious ditch? We are so far deep into that ditch today. Everybody says, I can pierce or tat or abort or do whatever I want with my body because it's my body. And not all those things are necessarily bad. I understand that we have a freedom and a right. But when we become so untethered that we think we can do anything we want, what do you become? You become a reckless and chaotic and anarchistic society. And what you end up doing, now don't miss this, when we go into that ditch, we end up losing our freedoms, not gaining them. You say, but that is freedom. No, you don't understand. See, when we begin to live over in that lawless state, what we do is we end up destroying the very freedom that we live in. I'll give you an example. When the Titanic hit the iceberg and all of a sudden it started to sink, there were some rules on the boat. There were some order on the boat. If you were in third class, guess what? You can't go hang out in the first class lounge. But once the thing hit the iceberg, what happened? All bets were off. And if you wanted to head up to first class, you go right ahead. You knock yourself up, drink all the booze, steal the silverware, play soccer in the dining room. You're all going to the bottom of the ocean anyway. And see, this is what happens in a society like ours when we think we should be allowed to do whatever we want because it's my life, it's my body, it's my this, my that. And so that's the other ditch. And so you say, well, what then is liberty? Well, liberty's a little bit harder to understand. And I think what you have to do is you have to, again, go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to the Garden of Eden. And in the Garden of Eden, I want you to think about this. How many rules did Adam and Eve have? They had one rule. How many did they keep? None. They had one rule. One rule. Hey, guys, don't eat of the fruit of that tree. Please don't eat of the fruit of the tree. You can do anything you want. Don't eat of that tree. Huh? What tree? What tree? And like 3 minutes later, depending on how fast you read, they're at the tree. And they're eating of the fruit. And you think, what were you thinking? Now, here's the bigger question, though. Here's the bigger question. How are they going to do what was right? How are they going to live right? I'll tell you how. It says that they walked in the cool of the day with the Lord. They were going to live right out of their relationship with the living God is how they were going to do it. That was what the intention was, is if they walked with God, they would intuitively do what was right. The only thing, the one rule they got, they couldn't keep one rule. So then Moses comes along, the man falls, and Moses comes along, and he brings along the 630 rules. How many of the 630 did they break? All of them. They couldn't keep any of them. If they couldn't keep one, they're not going to keep 630. And so then that's why Jesus finally came. And Jesus died on the cross. And the reason Jesus died on the cross was to give you liberty, to give you freedom. And this is what Jesus said. He said, another commandment, a new commandment I give you, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And don't miss the rest of it. He says, for on this hang all the law and the prophet. He said, if you will do those two things, if you will love God and love your neighbor, you know what? You'll actually end up fulfilling the whole law. And that's all you really need. You see, that's what liberty is. You say, well, how would that work? Well, here's how it works. If you love God, you're going to obey God. You're going to do what God asks you and wants you to do. If you love your neighbor, let's talk about the Ten Commandments for a moment. If you love your neighbor, you won't actually break the Ten Commandments. How is that? Well, if you love your neighbor, you won't kill him. Right? Right? Say right. I wasn't sure if you were sure about that. If you love your neighbor, you won't kill him. If you love your neighbor, you won't steal from him. If you love your neighbor, you won't bear false witness against him. If you love your neighbor, you won't take his wife. Do you see how this is making sense? And so that's how this whole thing was meant to work. That we don't need a whole bunch of rules and regulations. That's what liberty is. And it's interesting what James called it. He called it the perfect law of liberty. He actually called it a law of liberty. And what was it? It's the spirit of the law. It's not the letter of the law. It's the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And guess what? Everything else is going to fall into place. So I remember when I first figured this out, and I thought, I'm going to raise my children like that. I'm going to raise my children with the spirit of the law. And some of you have heard this story before. And what I did was I instituted only 2 rules. If 2 rules are good enough for Jesus, 2 rules is good enough for me and my kids. So I said, here's the 2 rules. I said, don't burn down the house and don't draw blood. Those are my 2 rules. I thought, I can raise my kids with only 2 rules. And so anytime we went out, I'd say, hey kids, remember, don't burn down the house and don't draw blood. What did that actually mean? What was the spirit of that? The spirit of that was respect property and respect one another. And I figured that if they could get those 2 things, everything else would fall into place, right? So anyway, here's the story. We went out one night. I said to the kids, hey, kids, we're going out. And remember, don't burn down the house, don't draw blood. So we come back after a night out, and the living room window is broken. I said, why is the living room window broken? And they said, well, we were sort of playing soccer in the living room. I said, you were playing soccer in the living room? Why? They said, well, we didn't draw blood. I said, that's not good enough. You broke the window. I said, why'd you break the window? My daughter says, I had an open shot on net. So I said, well, you guys have done it. I'm giving you a 3rd rule, and you brought this on yourself. From now on, there'll be no burning down the house, there'll be no drawing blood, and there'll be no soccer in the house. Honest to God, true story. Week later, we go out. So I left. I said, hey, remember kids, don't burn the house, don't draw blood, no soccer. Out we go. We come back a few hours later. Our kids have a volleyball net set up in the living room. And they're playing volleyball and doing sets and spikes. I said, what are you doing? They said, you didn't say anything about volleyball, only no soccer. It just shows us how kind of thick we are about it, right? And this is why we struggle with liberty. But I do want you to know it can be done. And I'm going to give you the example of traffic. You know what? I love Winnipeg. I hate our traffic lights. We are the traffic light capital of the world. Have you noticed? Every time they build a new building, they put up a new traffic light. And every corner, there's a new traffic light. And why are there so many traffic lights? I'll tell you why. Because our city planners think you're a bunch of morons and that you will run into each other if they don't stop you every few hundred meters. We have a perimeter that goes all around our city so you can zip from one end to the other, except every few hundred meters. They have put up a stoplight to slow you down because you can't be trusted. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to need you to be real honest with me. How many of you have ever had that moment where you've come up to a red light and you look this way and you look that way and there was nobody around? Don't answer yet. Don't answer yet. I haven't finished the question. And you looked around and you were at least tempted to go through. How many were tempted? How many were tempted? Okay, now, how many of you actually went through it? You're going all straight to hell, every last one of them. We all do this, and you know what? Probably that one you went through was the one right in front of the church here, right? This left turn signal in front of the church is probably the single worst traffic light in our whole city. It's so frustrating, and it feels like we can't be trusted. There are no cars coming, but you're not allowed to go through it because that is the letter of the law. So here's where we're going with this. Mythbusters. Anybody like that show? Sure. So Mythbusters is going to solve this problem for us. And so what they decided, they wanted to do this little test to see what was faster, what was more efficient, a four-way stop or a roundabout. And so this is what they did. They were about to set it up in a parking lot with cones and stuff, and they were going to see how many cars could go through an intersection in 15 minutes. And then they decided to add a third piece to it. And the third piece was this. They were going to start with a traffic cop, and they were going to have the traffic cop direct traffic, and then they were going to set up a four-way stop and let people use the four-way stop like we do in North America, and then they were going to use the roundabout like they use in Europe. And so they did this test to see how many cars could get through in 15 minutes. Here's how it played out. The traffic cop, and of course, some of you know one of the guys there used to be a traffic cop, and so he went and directed traffic. And in 15 minutes, here he was, and he got through, how many cars? 289 cars in 15 minutes. Then there was the four-way stop. We all know how to use a four-way stop, don't we? You yield to the person on the right. So they set up the four-way stop. 385 cars got through with the four-way stop. But here it is, the roundabout. Guess how many cars got through it? 460 cars got through that roundabout. What's the big difference between these? Let me explain this. The traffic cop, that's a dictatorship, isn't it? It's where one man tells you what you can and cannot do and when you can and when you cannot do it. And then you have the four-way stop, which is the letter of the law. You stop at the four-way stop whether there's a car coming or not. Am I right about that? Because if you don't, you get a ticket. How many of you have tried that? The ticket thing. Oh, some hands still going up. Wow, same people went through the red light. Fancy that. And so the four-way stop is the letter of the law. You just do what you have to do. But the more efficient way is the roundabout, and that's the spirit of the law. And here's what it is. It trusts you to know what to do, when to do it. And if there's no cars coming, you go. And if you need to stop, you stop. And see, that's how liberty works. That's how the gospel is supposed to work. That we're not supposed to have all these rules and regulations and we keep them whether they're good to keep or not. What we do is we have the freedom to do what is right when we need to do it. And you see, that's what liberty is all about. See, he came to set the captives free. That's what Jesus' mission was. But Satan's mission is to keep you in bondage and to enslave you. And as I said many times, people will take that freedom and they will use it to enslave themselves. Stand fast in the liberty in which Christ has made you free. He has done everything necessary for you to live free. He wants you to be free. He wants you to walk in liberty, the perfect law of liberty, which is the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. He came to set the captives free, and greater is he who is in you than he that is in the world, and he who the Son sets free is free indeed. Let's stand together, shall we?
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.